Hopefully some of you know who I am, but just in case you don't, I'm Chris. I fly around the world talking about technology and finance, and normally I talk about open banking and what's happening in technology and banking with APIs and the Internet of Things. But this is a blockchain focus group, so I'm going to focus on blockchain. Just before I present anything further, how many of you understand blockchain? And can everyone hear me okay? Okay. I think it's just been increased in volume. So some of you understand blockchain, but many of you may not. And it's interesting because I haven't actually given a dedicated blockchain presentation for over a year. And the reason for that is that the subject has kind of gone off the boil. And in English, that means it's not so interesting. And the reason it's not so interesting is that it got to be fascinating about 2 years ago. And everybody was talking about blockchain. But if you go to most conferences around the world today, it's not actually top of the agenda. In fact, in many of the technology and banking conferences, it's not even on the agenda, which is surprising. And I've written a number of books. In fact, I write a blog every day, thefinancer.com. And so if you want to know what's going on in the world of technology and banking and finance, then join the blog. It's free. And I've been writing a blog every single day for 11 years, which is a long time. In fact, almost 12 years, every single day, because I'm really boring and dedicated to trying to understand technology and finance. And out of the blog has come a number of books. Digital Bank came out in 2014, ValueWeb 2015, and Digital Human this year. I think the first two have been translated into Turkish, but Digital Human hasn't been, so it should be. BKM translated the other two, so they're good friends of mine. In fact, that's the reason why I'm here, because I actually really like Turkey, and I like Istanbul in particular, and I like networking with you guys, so hopefully you'll stay around afterwards and spend some time talking. ValueWeb that came out 2 years ago was all about blockchain, and it kind of shows to me that for a couple of years, blockchain and that discussion was very high on the agenda in the media, in the conferences, in conversations. And yet, it, as I say, has gone off the agenda. So what's going on? Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of confusion about what this is all about. And you have to be really good technologically to understand the technology itself. This clicker's not working, so maybe
have it off.
Got to turn it on. Got to switch it on. There you go. So to put the technology in context, this is my summary of open banking. And this is a whole other presentation that takes an hour, so I'm not giving that one. But basically, that presentation is all about the user experience in the front office, is where humanity comes through digitally. The middle office is a marketplace of APIs, which is plug-and-play code from hundreds of thousands of FinTech startups that are really good at that code. And the back office is now all about the data, which is machine learning and distributed ledger technology. And artificial intelligence, in particular in the back office, is going to be the differentiator between the banks that survive and the banks that lose. And as I say, that's a long presentation, but it puts it in context that it's this back office that's where the action is. So I'll be showing it again in 2 seconds. Hopefully we'll share the slides. The slides you can give away, I don't mind. But the back office is where the action is. And the reason why blockchain is taking so long is that to change a bank's back office takes a long time. To change an industry's back office takes even longer. And this is where the challenge lies, that we're talking about a technology that will reconstruct the core infrastructure of financial services. And to do that is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take quite a long time. Also, this technology is really confusing. I think it combines everything we don't understand about technology with everything we don't understand about money. Because almost every day something is happening with blockchain and distributed ledger technology and cryptocurrencies that changes my outlook of this world. And it's not constant, it changes every day. And when you look at some of the things that have been going on, particularly related to blockchain, it's created a very bad image of this marketplace. For example, cryptocurrencies, and we have to start with cryptocurrencies because this is where blockchain technology was spawned. 10 years ago, in November 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto posted his white paper about a cryptocurrency called Bitcoin. In that white paper, there was no mention of blockchain. The phrase did not appear. There was a discussion around recording transactions in blocks on a chain of a database, but it wasn't blockchain. That's the shortened name that we've given it. And Bitcoin then became something that everyone looked at and thought it's not very good because it's not backed by governments, it's unregulated. And then the banks looked at Bitcoin and looked at the technology recording transactions on a chain of blocks and said, actually blockchain is good, but Bitcoin is bad. And then everyone got into creating other versions of Bitcoin that were better. But were they? Are they? You know, does Bitcoin Cash beat Bitcoin itself? What about Ether or IOTA or Ripple, XRP? You know, which ones do you invest in? And then it became a huge bubble. And my favorite example of why Bitcoin is appropriate and why digital currencies are appropriate is from Venezuela. And this is a Venezuelan bolivar. And it would cost you 2.5 million Venezuelan bolivars to buy a toilet roll 6 months ago because the economy just tanked, which is the reason why Venezuelans all invested in Bitcoin. And you would, because Bitcoin was doing well. And there's a lengthy discussion around Bitcoin, but at the end of the day, I don't like Bitcoin. And you may go, well, I like it. The reason I don't like it is that it's unregulated. And a lot of the people who are big fans of Bitcoin said we have money without government. And I kind of go, money doesn't exist without government, because the whole reason why money exists is that governments want to tax you. And that's one of the reasons why you have regulated markets and regulated institutions like banks. So money without government is not a good thing. And that's very well illustrated by some of the things that have been happening with the Bitcoin price in the last year. You've probably been watching the Bitcoin price, but this time last year, my Bitcoin investment was worth 10 times more than it is today. This time 2 years ago, it was worth 1/10 of what it was a year ago. So, you know, the Bitcoin bubble is an interesting concept, but not something that I would personally bet my house on or put my mortgage in. But out of Bitcoin came this thing called blockchain, and John Reed, who's the former CEO and chairman of Citigroup, put it very well, which is that money is simply a ledger for keeping track of transactions, and Bitcoin is the best version that we've seen of that concept. And that's why bankers get very interested in what we can do with the technology, because effectively a blockchain distributed ledger technology can record transactions without any human hand involved. So we can keep a database of transactions, credits and debits, between institutions, between individuals, with no human hand needed to actually manage that database. And right now, if you look at the financial system, we spend billions of dollars a year recording and managing those transactions. If you think about the global investment markets and clearing and settlement, which is the resolution of transactions of trading, about $20 billion is spent just to reconcile debits and credits on their databases as an overhead, you know, a human overhead of recording and working out who's paid what for what. If you could do that automatically through the internet as a ledger system, then that would save billions, not just in clearing and settlement, but in all areas of financial services. That's why bankers have got really excited about blockchain, and why, as John puts it, it's making a great version of something that's been around for a long time because it's automated. It's also interesting because in my other presentation I'll spend more time talking about it, but it has meant that the banking system is no longer banking, but it's technology. 4 years ago, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, wrote to his shareholders and said, Silicon Valley is coming to eat our lunch. And he's right, which is the reason why JP Morgan's been hiring people who can code. About 25% of the jobs in JP Morgan are now having a title of engineer. They're no longer hiring bankers. It's interesting that JP Morgan Chase in 2016 had 245,000 employees worldwide, and yet today they have 160,000. They've been getting rid of all of the human bankers and automating as much as they can. The only reason why I put this up here is that I loved what happened the day after his letter came out, which is there was a bus going around New York saying, "You're right, Jamie, Bitcoin will eat your lunch." You know, this is what worries the bankers, that the whole point of Satoshi Nakamoto's paper was to get rid of the intermediary. If you read the paper, have any of you read Nakamoto's paper about Bitcoin? Front row. It's always down here, isn't it? It says, you know, the whole idea is to create a transaction value exchange system that has no intermediaries involved. So there would be no central counterparties, there would be no central banks, there would be no banks. You just do everything direct through the technology. And as I say, there's then this friction between that idea of decentralized, unregulated, and centralized and regulated. And this is a really interesting friction that's been going on for a decade now. You know, November 2008, the paper came out. For a decade, we talked about how does decentralized work in a centralized marketplace. We have central banks, we have central counterparty clearing, we have custodians that are centralized. How do we decentralize centralized systems? What does that mean? How does it work? And Bitcoin isn't the only game out there, but it represents the roller coaster we've been through. I quite enjoy telling the story that in 2013 I lost $10,000 on Bitcoin. It's because I had them on Mt. Gox, unregulated. You don't get them back. Now I invest in regulated marketplaces like Coinbase. But even then, you know, it's not necessarily ideal, particularly when you have this volatility. And the volatility is just representing a very small marketplace. If you think that over $5 trillion a day is transacted in foreign exchange marketplaces, then a 5 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion cryptocurrency marketplace is small and very volatile. And there's lots of currencies out there. The last count I had, there's over 1,500 cryptocurrencies in the world. Who needs them? Which ones are going to work? Why do you need them? How are they going to work? And this is the reason I think why we spent 10 years talking about blockchain, because we're doing lots of proof of stake, proof of work, proof of concept, but are we producing anything? Are we implementing anything? There's very little production out there of distributed ledger blockchain systems. And the ones that are out there in production tend to be very isolated within a single institution. They're not actually working across many institutions. There's been a long discussion around SWIFT, which is the messaging system between all the banks of the world, being out of date and could be replaced by this technology. But if you look at SWIFT, they have 9,000 banks involved in their network. How do you get 9,000 banks to agree something that's new? That's the challenge. It's easy to do this if you're the Australian Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, who have got blockchain-based clearing systems. But to try and do this across 9,000 banks on a globalized basis is much harder. And that's why this technology is interesting for me, because it will, at the end of the day, get there. But how long does it take to get there? We're 10 years down the road. How much longer do we have? Equally, what do we base our bets on? You know, Bitcoin's been around 10 years, then Ethereum came out in 2015, written by Vitalik Buterin when he was 19 years old. And what's interesting about Ethereum is it's been produced by a teenager, but the markets of the world are now betting their future on this technology, smart contracts. The only difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum is that Ethereum allows public and private ledger-based systems. And it allows you to do smart exchange on a program contract basis. Bitcoin is completely public and transparent. This doesn't have to be, it can be private. And that's the reason why corporations like it, because they don't like the idea of completely transparent, open ledger, database systems. Everyone can see who's transacting what with whom. They want some of it to be kept private, so that only the people involved in the transaction can see the transaction on the ledger. And that's what Ethereum allows. And it's not just this Ethereum. There's, again, a whole range of other services out there that do the same. But Ethereum, because it's backed by Microsoft, has taken over a lot of the attention of the distributed ledger community. blockchain. I actually don't like the word blockchain. And the reason I don't like it is that it's become a bit of a dirty word and it's a bit confusing. It's associated with cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. And so what's interesting is now people don't talk about blockchain, they talk about distributed ledger technology, DLT. And there is a big difference between DLT and blockchain. The major difference is that DLT, distributed ledger technology, does not need a blockchain. And yet everyone thinks it's blockchain, just names something else for the banking community. It's different. Both technologies are trying to do the same thing, which is to create this ability to share a database with people you don't trust. And in fact, that's the bottom line, which is sharing information with people you don't trust, and yet being able to trust them because the network looks after the relationship and the recording of the transactions. The internet manages this. The way it does it is through 4 mechanisms, of which blockchain is one. So distributed ledger technology comprises 4 pieces. You don't have to have all 4 pieces. You can have 3 or 2 of them even. But the 4 pieces are that you have some form of currency to record the transaction. In most cases, a cryptocurrency or a digital currency. It could be a government-issued, bank-issued digital currency. You have a digital signature to authorize the transaction, that records the transaction with authorization. You have a consensus mechanism, which means that the internet network of that currency votes that's actually a legitimate transaction. If you look at how Bitcoin works and the whole idea of blockchain, to record a transaction on the blockchain, more than 50% of the network has to approve it. And that's why you automate the whole idea of the database and sharing of databases between people who don't trust each other, because the network votes for legitimate transactions. Otherwise, it won't authorize and record them. And that's one of the real reasons why it became of interest to the banking community, because what Bitcoin solved is the double spending issue. The fact that once you've recorded the transaction, you can't record it again. That's it. For all time, you recorded that transaction once, it's done. So if you went and spent 100 Turkish lira at the bar, you couldn't go back and spend another 100 Turkish lira with the same note. You spent that note, it's gone. You have to have another note. That's exactly how distributed ledger technology works. Once you spent the currency, it's gone. It's like cash. But it has to be authorized and recorded with a consensus to make it an automated networked transaction. And the network approves and manages the trust of those transactions. So if the network approves and records the transaction, you can trust that it's a correct transaction. That's the whole way in which this solves the trust between people you don't trust. Sharing databases between people you don't trust. The network provides the trust. And then finally, you have the blockchain itself, which is the recording of those transactions. My favorite examples of where the use cases are for this technology are several. In fact, my number one is for charity and charitable donations. And this is something that's in production in China, run by Alibaba, which is the big commercial platform in China, a little bit like Amazon, if you want a comparison. And what Alibaba offers is, if you give money to charity, quite often in China, you have no idea that the charity you're giving to gets the money. So using distributed ledger technology, Alibaba's created a system where transparently you can see exactly how much of your money went to the donation cause that you were giving to, how much got received at the end, by whom. And because it's on a blockchain distributed ledger, it's completely transparent in their implementation. It doesn't have to be. You can create private versions. But in their implementation, you can immediately see how much of my money got to the charity that I'm giving to. It's a great use case. Another great use case is Everledger, which is one of my favorite startup companies in the distributed ledger technology regime. And if you don't know Everledger, what they record, and they started out to begin with, was recording the legitimacy of diamonds. So in De Beers and the diamond exchanges of the world, how do you know that this is the real diamond? How do you know its quality and its pedigree and its history? And so they started recording and transacting the diamonds on the blockchain, which meant that if it was a blood diamond, a fake diamond, a diamond that isn't bona fide from one of the proper resources of the world, then it's not on the blockchain, therefore it's not recorded, therefore it's not real, according to the database. They actually moved on from recording diamonds, and they're now recording fine art, fine wine, things that you think are worth a lot of money. But how do you know that Picasso actually painted that painting? Or that that wine actually came from Rothschilds? Record it on his distributed ledger. Keep up a record that can be trusted and transparent. And that's how we ended up with this idea that this is a foundational technology for the future. It will change the world when it's working. And the reason it will change the world when it's working is that it's as important as www, the internet itself. If you imagine that everything in Turkey could be run on a database that the government shares with the businesses of Turkey and the banks of Turkey, and they all trust this database, and it's automated, it's completely automatic, there's no humans involved. Imagine the efficiency gains that you get as a country. Get rid of all the civil servants. Just let it all be recorded through the network automatically. Every citizen has a digital ID issued by this database that's transparent and trusted. So we can immediately see who you are, where you came from, whether you are real or whether you are fake. It's foundational, that's transformational. But imagine how long it will take for the Turkish government to agree that with all the businesses and banks of Turkey. It's the reason why it's not here yet. It's the reason why it's not here in any country yet. It's bubbling away in many countries. But when it is delivered, and I think it will be delivered, I don't think it's an if, I think it's when, then we'll see some radical changes. In banking and financial services, which is where I spend most of my time, I've been working around these 6 areas of use cases. And they're fascinating. There's hundreds of startup companies in each area. For example, Tallysticks and Wave have been working with Barclays Bank on the supply chain automation processes with their corporate customers. And further to several trials, they've found that they can get rid of all the paperwork in the supply chain. And if you're familiar with supply chains, then you'll know that you have bills of lading, letters of credit, invoice receivables and purchase orders and lots of other paperwork that has to be reconciled to work out when this is delivered on my doorstep from China, how did it get here, did I order it, is it the right number of parts, is it the right value, how do I see that in my bank account, where's the payment come from going to, that's complicated. It's not if you automate the whole thing, get rid of all the paper and get the network to manage the whole process for you, to show you the whole transaction history, transparently with trust. That's what Tallysticks and Wave have done, got rid of all that paperwork. In payments, there's loads and loads of examples, and my favorite, in fact, is a company called Stella, or Interstellar, as they're called now, because they merged with a company called Chain. And Stella is a company that provides remittances between many different payments corridors, but the remittance corridors of the world have been ripped off for years by Western Union. And the idea that I could send money from America to the Philippines or India to Africa without any cost, near enough, is now being realized through companies like Abra and Stella. I can move money across borders for almost nothing. Because when you think about it, that's what the network is. Moving money around as just data, as files and digits. Why should we pay hundreds of dollars to move data around? In clearing and settlements, there's a number of companies that are starting up focused on this area, including some very influential people like Blythe Masters, who founded Digital Asset Holdings, formerly one of the major senior vice presidents of JP Morgan dealing with derivatives. A friend of mine called Peter Randall has created Settle, which is a company focused on clearing and settlement. And Peter was formerly the founder of a company called Chi-X Bats Trading, which is one of the major equities trading platforms of the world. The chairman of Settle is Sir David Walker, formerly the chairman of Barclays Bank. Senior, serious bankers are getting into this space because they can see it's going to change the future of money. The one area that almost every day I get an email saying, have you seen our blockchain distributed ledger technology use case prototype for digital identity? I get something about that almost every single day. And the reason is it's the area that everybody believes this technology is the most relevant for. But equally, it's the one that's the most difficult to do. Because every country has a different identity scheme. And think about your identity. What is your identity? Is it government issued? Is it bank issued? Is it you? I have my passport, I have my driving license. Is that my identity? And why does the bank or a government have to give me my identity card? Why can't I have my own? And then I can let them have it when they need it. And this is what people are working on today. There's one of these companies called Evonym, which is an open-sourced, self-sovereign identity scheme. And what that actually means in practice is that with decentralization of the internet, we can decentralize data and we can decentralize identity schemes. So every one of you will have your own identity scheme that you own. No one issues you with it, it's yours. But you share it on an anonymous basis on demand when it's needed. So if a bank needs to verify who you are, you give them a version of your identity scheme that's yours that they can use for verification purposes. It's the same with government or hospitals or anyone else. Which means your identity can never be stolen because it's decentralized and it's yours. The whole reason why identities are stolen is because right now they're centralized. If we decentralize identity schemes, they can't be stolen, or not as easily. You may think that's all fictitious, well, it's actually starting to happen. There's a number of banks starting to use the open-sourced code of Evonym to create self-sovereign identity schemes that you own, which is why it's self-sovereign, that they don't own. There's a great scheme that's being developed in the United Nations. I call it the impossible dream because I think it might be impossible, but the impossible dream is to develop an identity scheme for every human on Earth. And if you look at the United Nations Sustainability Goals for 2030, of which there's a wide range, but number 16 is about peaceful and inclusive societies, and goal number 16.9 is that every human on Earth is issued a legal identity scheme by 2030. And right now, 2.5 billion people on Earth don't exist because they've never had an identity issued by any government that's recognized by anybody. And the problem with that is that if you don't have an identity that's issued and recognized, then I can take you and put you into slavery. I can sell you onwards to other people. I can put you into prostitution or anything I want to do with you because you don't exist, according to the government. And that's the reason why this is a really important ambition. Because when so many people on Earth don't have identity schemes that are recognized, then they can easily be abused. But even if you have an identity scheme that's recognized, then if that's taken off me and burnt, do I exist? Give me a digital version. A paper version is out of date. What's intriguing is that the biggest identity scheme in the world right now is the Aadhaar scheme in India, where over 1 billion Indian citizens have an identity that's now government recognized. They don't have to be able to write, they just give a fingerprint, and biometrically they're recognized as an Indian citizen. You have to have an Aadhaar identity in India to use banking or payments or most of the government services and benefit systems, which is why over 1 billion Indians have an Aadhaar identity scheme. The issue with the Aadhaar identity scheme is that it's 10 years old and it's on a centralized database. So India's now moving the whole scheme across to what they call the India chain, which is a blockchain distributed ledger technology implementation of digital identity for India. How that will work with the United Nations scheme and the Evonym scheme, I have no idea. Does it matter? No. But what it does mean is that this will probably be the first and largest implementation of blockchain in the world, and definitely one to watch. The other area that's massively growing in blockchain use is in real estate. In that a lot of records of property are paper-based, and often, actually, they don't exist. I recently moved to Poland, and in Poland, they have quite a few communistic things still hanging around in their processes. And so I bought a car, and to register the car, I had to go to the government office and get recognized as a resident of Warsaw and get a Polish identity number. So identity schemes again. To get the identity number, I had to prove that I was living in the house and who owned the house. And I'm renting a house, my landlord came with me. And my landlord brought the property deed records that were from 1990. And the government office wouldn't recognize them because it was a photocopy. They would only recognize the original, which he didn't have. So does he own the house? Or he just claims to? That's the reason why, again, property records is a massive implementation use case for blockchain. We did get the government accept the photocopy in the end. And I did get my identity number, I do have the car, but it was a real sort of rigmarole. It took 2 days to sort out. But if we can get all of these things digitized on a trusted and transparent platform that everyone agrees they can work with, then you can see it's going to change the world. And the challenge is how to get the acceptance of standards and operations around the platform. And equally, is the platform ready for prime time? I've blogged about all these things for quite some time in depth. I think my first blockchain Bitcoin blog was 2011. But in 2016, I wrote about all these use cases in depth. And I still write on occasion about blockchain. And these days, if I was writing about it, I'll probably write about companies like Ripple, which XRP is completely irrelevant, so don't invest in Ripple cryptocurrency. It has nothing to do with what Ripple is doing with banks. And what Ripple is doing with banks is basically trying to get direct counterparty exchange through the network with trust in real time. One of their clients is the National Bank of Abu Dhabi. And the National Bank of Abu Dhabi, when they talk about this, said, right now, it takes about 4 hours to drive from Abu Dhabi to Muscat in Oman. But it takes about 4 days to transfer money through the SWIFT network. That's ridiculous. So they use Ripple. And that's the reason why Ripple believed that they could replace SWIFT. Although I think I'm of the opinion that if Ripple seriously starts to challenge the SWIFT network, then the banks will tell SWIFT to buy Ripple, which may well happen. I've already mentioned Stella. And the reason why I brought Stella back, because these are the major distributed ledger developments in financial services, is that Jeb, who was the founder of Stella, originally was the founder of Ripple. And he fell out with the co-founder, so he created another network. And they are related, but this one is far more focused upon remittances rather than bank counterparty clearing and payments. R3, who you may have heard of, is a bank-invested consortia that has been developing distributed ledger technology for the banking system, and they created a thing called Corda, C-O-R-D-A. What's been interesting is that they had a lot of traction with the banking community, but then it stopped when they announced Corda. And the reason it stopped is that they wanted to get another $250 million investment to create the platform for the banking system. And several of the banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, said no and walked away. But they're still developing, and then they got into a huge controversy because they had this slide up. Corda isn't a traditional blockchain platform. It doesn't actually use blockchain. And that's why I say we're combining everything we don't understand about technology with everything we don't understand about money, because how can you have distributed ledger that doesn't have blockchain? This is blockchain inspired. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that it's using a proprietary developed structure for the banking system that's much more relevant for banks, that doesn't need the blockchain ledger database, but it does need consensus distributed ledger technology. Now I'm getting confusing, and it's getting technical, and it takes a long time to go through all this stuff, but if you're really interested, go and find out more. Read my blog, read the books, there's loads out there. But I guess I'm just coming back to, it's the reason why so many trials, proofs of concept, proofs of work, have not delivered anything in production, because it's confusing, it's difficult. A recent study found that all of the blockchain initiatives have not been able to use this technology to achieve their objectives. The Bank of England tried out Ethereum for real-time gross settlement, thinking that that could replace our clearing and settlement system in the UK. They came up with the conclusion, not yet. And the reason for the conclusion is they said Ethereum is just an experiment. Ethereum did a hard fork a couple of years ago. Ethereum rebooted. And when it rebooted, Vitalik Buterin just said, this is an experiment. How can you put the real-time gross settlement system of a country on an experiment? But everyone's trying to. Lots and lots of discussions, lots and lots of efforts to try and change the old traditional system to be much more relevant for the future and much more ready for today. So I guess in conclusion, there's huge amounts taking place in research into blockchain and distributed ledger technology. There's huge amounts of confusion about what it is. There's huge amounts of challenge around, do you need cryptocurrencies, do you need blockchain, or can we develop some other database formats? There are lots of areas where it could be transformational. If we could get digital identities onto a shared system that governments and institutions trust, if we could put all the payments and settlement systems of the world into something that doesn't need a human hand to reconcile and manage them. But the bottom line is that an awful lot of what's going on is what I would call faster horses, which is taking what we have had historically and trying to make it better and cheaper and more efficient with technology, rather than starting again and thinking about what could we do with this technology if we started anew and afresh. In fact, it's interesting that there's a couple of countries right now that are doing interesting things. So, for example, Luxembourg has a space mining distributed ledger database. And you may say, that's a bit fictional, isn't it? What have they got that for? You know, mining asteroids. Well, America has one, but in America's law about space mining, you have to be an American registered company to mine in space. In Luxembourg, you don't have to be. And so they're trying to make their own space to be competitive, starting anew. China's amazing. China's doing so many different things. I could talk about what China's doing for another couple of hours, but I'm aware of time. But in particular, what China's doing is leading the distributed ledger technology space. One of the things the Bitcoinistas say is that we've got money without government. You cannot ban Bitcoin. Guess who's banned Bitcoin? China. And successfully. You cannot trade or exchange Bitcoin in China today. You could a couple of years ago. But they've registered more blockchain distributed ledger patents than any other country. Alibaba and Tencent have more patents than any other companies in the world. And China is leading this development into the next generation of database systems. So watch that space. Also watch Dubai, in that Dubai's made announcements that they will run their whole economy on the blockchain by 2020. I don't know how near they are. They're doing it with IBM and Ethereum. But the key thing they say is that if we can do this, we're going to save ourselves billions of dollars of civil servant costs by 2020, which is why they've made that commitment. So there are things happening that will make this production, that will make a difference, and will change our worlds over time. Last thoughts is quantum computing is predicted to wipe out blockchain technology. So just as we've got to grips with talking about this, there's another technology coming that's going to completely decimate it. I had a company recently at a meeting called the Quantum Resistant Ledger, QRL, the Quantum Resistant Ledger. And there's already blockchain development companies developing distributed ledger technology to be quantum computing resistant. So it won't wipe out the technology, but it will be interesting to see what happens. And equally, I did blog a while ago that it's going to take about 10 years for this technology to become mainstream, mainly because it's 5 years to develop it into something that the industry can agree, and then another 5 years by the time it reaches you and I on the high street, on the main street. So I wrote that in 2016. It's now 2018, so we've still got about 8 years to go. And so that's really everything I've got to say about blockchain right now. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.